Hello and welcome to the Washington Urban Debate League's Novice Video Series. Today, we're going to talk about topicality, how to keep the affirmative from cheating one debate at a time. First, we'll walk through what is topicality, we'll touch on the parts of the argument, how to debate topicality during a debate, and how to answer it when you are the affirmative. When I use the word topicality, what am I talking about? Well, the name says it all. Topicality, or T, is a debate about whether the affirmative is on topic. This is an argument that makes sure the affirmative plan follows the rules or norms of debate and is offering a proposal that falls under the resolution. Topicality, whether the affirmative's plan is on topic, is governed by that plan text, not by the advantage areas they choose to debate. Topicality is a debate about debate. What topics should we discuss, and why are we talking about them? Thinking critically about what you talk about as a debater and why you do so will help you in topicality. Are you topical? Well, what the topic is always comes to some degree of interpretation that is resolved through debate. Think of the resolution as a giant umbrella. All of the topical affirmatives fall underneath. Lots of other cases exist outside the umbrella, but they're getting wet and aren't topical, aka they shouldn't be debated this year. Is debate biased towards the affirmative? They get to speak first and last. They choose the topic each debate round is about, and they have a competitive incentive to be unpredictable, make it hard to answer them. Well, in many ways, yes. Topicality, however, is the negative's defense against unpredictable and off-topic affirmatives. Topicality is also useful to prove a point when used in concert with other positions. So what is this resolution? Well, this year's topic is that the United States federal government should substantially increase its funding and/or regulation of primary and/or secondary education in the United States. There are some key words you'll probably notice here. They have some words such as substantial and increase that are used almost every year. This year, we're going to be talking about funding and regulation as the actions that the plan texts take. And we're going to be talking about primary and secondary and education as whether the actions taken fall under the right categories and apply to the right types of students and schools. So, what are the parts of a topicality argument? Debating topicality is rather straightforward. This is a debate about definitions. There are three pieces: an interpretation, a violation, and standards. If you think about topicality through the lens of a disadvantage, it'll help you conceptualize the argument. The interpretation is the uniqueness, how things are now. The violation is the link. What's the plan doing that's causing a problem? And the standards are the impacts. What are those problems caused by the plan action? A topicality interpretation is a statement of what you think the topic should be. What should it include and what it should not include. For a given debate round, you only need to include the part of the topic that the affirmative doesn't fit under. Good interpretations are specific and supported with evidence, and great interpretations intend to define the words. They use exclusive versus inclusive language, and they use terms of art specific to that year's policy area. Let's walk through some examples. Education could be direct instruction by a teacher to students in a classroom. That is a specific, clear definition. A regulation could be a legally binding rule created by a federal agency to govern a specific policy area. This specifically excludes other actions such as laws written by Congress. Increase could refer to growth or development specifically different from creating something from zero. And substantial could be more than 50% or $10 million, depending on what unit you use to define substantial. Let's talk about the violation. First, We've explained what the topic should look like and identified the boundaries of where the topic ends. The violation states specifically where those boundaries have been crossed by the affirmative plan. This is the link, the thing the affirmative plan does that's wrong and creates bad debate. Good violations are as specific as possible. They show topical versions of similar cases the affirmative could have used if they weren't trying to cheat. They are nuanced and detailed, and if you can identify multiple things the affirmative team has done wrong, that's always a plus. Let's walk through some examples. Let's take our definition of education from earlier. A violation could be that the plan, school vouchers let's say, is about how people pay for education, which has nothing to do between the interactions between a student and a teacher in the classroom. Let's take our definition of regulation from earlier. If the plan is a law passed by Congress and not a rule created by a federal agency, then it falls outside the boundaries of the topic. Let's take our definition of increase. If the plan is an entirely new program, they are creating something, not increasing an existing program. If we take either of our definitions from substantial and apply them to a small, irrelevant proposal by the affirmative, if it only impacts a few students in a few classrooms or doesn't cost very much, then the negative shouldn't have to bother debating such a small proposal. The last piece of a topicality argument are the standards. Once you've established what the rules are, the interpretation, and how the affirmative is breaking them, the violation, then you need to explain why the rules are good and how the interpretation is bad for you. Think of this as the impact debate. It usually comes down to a question of two main concepts, fairness and education. Our society generally considers fairness to be a virtue, and it is usually an assumption made when entering a competition that it is fair. If a competition isn't fair, why do we bother trying to compete? When it comes to education, well, debate is an educational activity first and foremost. If one team decreases the value of that education, there's something wrong. This usually involves a debate where the breadth, wider and shallower discussion of topics, or depth, narrow or deeper discussions of topics, is better, and whether the benefits of a debate come from the pre-round preparation or the in-round exchange and critical thinking skills. Theory and topicality debates are the same as any other, where there is a link and an impact. To build a link story, think about how the affirmative negatively impacts you in this round or justifies bad behavior in other rounds. Some link between the violation and these concepts of fairness and education are as follows. An untopical plan could skew the time and strategy of the negative to their competitive disadvantage. They could be an undue research burden on the negative. They could prevent a proper clash and exchange of ideas. They could make the topic unbalanced, giving most of the good arguments to one side or the other. They could make the topic too large or too small, or they could simply be very unpredictable and hard to answer. Building a convincing story of reasons why the affirmative has harmed you isn't enough to win a topicality debate. You have to make the connection to education and fairness. This gets you across the finish line. Think about how this will impact the round, how this will impact your preparation for other rounds, how this will impact the rest of your debate career and the community as a whole, and what bad behavior does the affirmative justify, even if they don't do so themselves. In some circles, topicality is no longer a 100% victory for the negative, but it's treated like a disadvantage. But in the local WUDL circuit, this is likely an all-or-nothing proposition. Let's walk through an example. Regulation versus laws. Regulations and laws are different. We've established that through our interpretation and our violation. The link could show that how the inclusion of laws as well as regulations makes the topic much larger, increasing the research burden on the negative. They have to research a whole new set of affirmatives. and this also could encourage generic negative strategies to respond to a wide array of cases, which is less educational to all those involved. It also leads to a degree of unpredictability. There are too many possible cases for a coherent, non-generic strategy, and it encourages a breadth over depth discussion, reducing the educational value of the round and reducing the clash and exchange of ideas, both of which are bad for debate. The impact could be that generic arguments hurt critical thinking and reduce our education on the topic. Education policy is a large and diverse policy area that is critically important for us as students to understand. Researching and debating specific policy actions by the Department of Education is important to our future. This predictable, meaningful standard could be key to fairness, so each side can be prepared to clash, instead of a large, disorganized discussion about potential laws somehow related to education. Topicality doesn't have to be an argument you plan to go for in later speeches. It can also be used for getting your opponent to agree to things elsewhere in the debate. Topicality can generally be read very quickly and represents a more existential threat to the affirmative than a single disadvantage. So the affirmative is likely willing to do whatever it takes to get rid of the topicality argument and deal with the consequences later. Topicality is generally considered an all-or-nothing argument. So if the negative wins, the round is over and they have won. You should debate topicality in the same manner. If you're going to go for it at the end of the round, the 2NR should be all about topicality. Introduce multiple violations, especially if they are related to one another. This can be very strategic. Tying topicality to other arguments, especially when it isn't clear which you plan to go for at the end of the debate, can also be helpful. Given the technical nature of the debate about debate that is topicality, be sure to go slow and respond to every little argument your opponent makes. So how do we answer topicality as the affirmative? If you don't respond to topicality, you just lost the round. So let's walk through the 4 ways to debate topicality. First is a counterinterpretation. This is a surefire way to engage the negative and defend yourself. This means reading a definition of what you think the topic should be that includes your affirmative. This is similar to a counterplan. Once a counterinterpretation has been introduced, the 2 ideas are compared to each other and the results of each are considered. Good counterinterpretations make the affirmative topical. They are specifically responsive to the interpretation and violation in question. They make many, quote, mainstream affirmatives topical and pass the gut check. They have to sound good. And they don't expand the topic too much without having a good reason to do so. The second way to answer topicality is to make a we meet argument. They may seem clear-cut to the negative, but that doesn't always mean that they are. Especially if the negative isn't familiar with their case, they might make a claim that it is something that it actually isn't. If so, it can be okay to accept the negative's interpretation of what the topic is, and just make the argument that you fit under their interpretation, and that there isn't a violation. This is usually done using your solvency evidence and their definition, explaining how they are the same thing. This can be a trap, since they're getting you to agree to a specific definition that can be used against you later. The third way to answer topicality is the standards. When you are defending a counterinterpretation, you also have to offer reasons why your counterinterpretation is good for debate, getting down to questions of education and fairness. You can play defense, arguing that the standards brought up by the other team are irrelevant. For example, you could say that unpredictability is inevitable, so who cares? You can also play offense, arguing that the standards brought up by the other team are actually good outcomes. For example, unpredictability can be good. It causes critical thinking skills to be used, and in-round adaptation is a greater source of education in debate than pre-round research. The last thing you should always mention is reasonability. This is best thought of as the impact defense on topicality. It's a simple argument that says the affirmative is close enough, even though there might be some technical issues with the case crossing the line. But if there's no harm, no foul, we're close enough. It's important to include that the harm suffered in this round, hopefully none, are much more important than hypothetical harms in other rounds. It's also important to discuss the rest of the negative strategy and to appeal to the judge, who is subjective.